There are various individual death in lonely situations that I can detail if we have time between now and the end of the programme. But to speak from alone is Seán Moynihan on the topic. Good morning, Seán. It's sad to say, Seán, there is literally an epidemic of loneliness, as is evident in these various cases. Cases like Mrs. Moynihan are just the tip of the iceberg, really. You know, you represent Alone, which is the national organisation that enables older people to age with dignity at home.
Yeah, I suppose we would support, last year we'd support around 42,000 older people. And everything from housing needs to transport needs to different type of health needs to food needs to everything you can think of. But the cross-cutting issue that affects people, whether they're short of money or have poor housing or have poor health, one of the biggest cross-cutting issue we have is loneliness. The levels of loneliness are extremely high, and the evidence is all there that it damages your physical and your mental health.
If I was to really look at the kernel of the problem, there are massive institutional and societal changes in Ireland. People are living longer, which is brilliant. So we have an ageing population. That, therefore, it has to increase the instance of loneliness across the population. But to juxtapose that, family size has got smaller. So there are less support for those who may be living alone. Children may be working abroad. They may be geographically too far to visit too often. Is it, I hate to coin the cliche, the perfect storm, but is this what's happening on the scale of loneliness? And no matter how hard you try, there will always be people like we had in Kerry, like we had at the Loch, like we had in Tipperary. There will always be people that slip through the cracks.
I think loneliness is a difficult thing, right? I think the reality of it is that the two items you mentioned, family size and ageing populations, absolutely are major contributors to why we need to change our health service, our housing service, but also we need to investigate and we need a strategy and a plan around loneliness. But unfortunately, loneliness also affects younger people. And, you know, it is a public health issue. I think the challenge has been, and we run the Loneliness Task Force, whereas we have 5,000 volunteers across the country doing the best we can. The scale of loneliness, we're the loneliest country in Europe, is beyond any one organisation. And what we need is policy, practice and a plan actually from government to address this across the whole life course, because it is damaging people's both physical and mental health. And unfortunately, Tilda, which is Trinity's longitudinal study on ageing, produced a report around 2 or 3 months ago, and they actually called it Loneliness Kills, which from researchers is a very strong statement in the title.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine when we're the most kind of societal, we have the crack, we're the most cultural, we're arguably the most poetic, we're arguably the most musical. There are reasons why people come to visit Ireland. It's all of that. And under the surface, then, this epidemic of loneliness.
I think at the end of the day, obviously it's really challenging, probably even to our view of ourselves. And I suppose that item, that two things can be true at the one time. All those energetic things around poetry, music, connection, community can all be going on, while we also still have a large percentage of people, young and old, struggling with loneliness, which is linked to mental health as well, and it also, as I said, damages all the physical health syndromes. So the reality is, it's not necessarily about blame. It's just that in an online world, in a world that has radically changed for everybody, that ultimately is maybe some of the connections we once automatically had in the community have been lost, and we actually have to plan to put them back in. We're very capable of doing this, but again, the size and the scale and the healthcare issue of this is we need actually a plan, and we need leadership from government and the departments responsible and involved.
Yeah, I know you did an interview with Barry Roach of the Southern correspondent of the Irish Times about a year ago, in which you did mention another factor in that things have moved online. People not just no longer collect their pension at the post office, but often get a FaceTime visit rather than a physical visit.
Look, combating loneliness, right, I think is about making emotional connection, right? So you can have social connections. Sometimes people think that if a service is provided, that somebody sees an individual, then ultimately you're combating loneliness. So if you take all our volunteers visiting older people, they start off meeting a social need, providing some practical support, linking into social activity. But as the relationship builds, they may build an emotional bond. And it's that emotional bond that improves people's health and well-being and ultimately helps take the edge off loneliness, while then rebuilding people's confidence to actually reach out. Because that's sometimes the thing. Oh, they want to be private, they don't want to reach out. But really, sometimes people are suffering so much, they've lost the confidence, the ability, or even the understanding to distinguish that actually loneliness is what's making them sad or is what's ultimately making them unhappy.
Mm-hmm. Of course, a huge part of our societal change is the denigration in numbers of your local butcher, your local bank. We've all heard about the hundreds of post offices that are closing, not to mention the pubs that are closing. And they were good social and meeting outlets. But now everything has gone into big multiples. Banking is more or less moving online. So there are really less opportunities for people. You can even get your shopping online. Less opportunities for people to interact and get out of the house and just get talking and chatting to someone.
This is it. I mean, like, the reality is as these things disappear, we lose something. We lose something. People might say we gain convenience and we gain speed, but we actually lose something. We lose that connection in the community. We lose those relationships. We lose some of those bonds that tie us, but also they are also bonds that keep us healthy and well. I mean, for us in alone, and people may not know this, but our actually highest levels of need, I was looking at reports the first quarter last year, and in general, that ultimately the people we provide the most support with of those 42,000 people are in Cork and Kerry.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose we've built a network of staff and volunteers, not a network of offices, right? Offices are big and expensive and hard to run.
So you're more nimble that way.
So it's on the road in the community. So the reality is, but that's where the highest level of need is. Ironically, loneliness is as bad in the urban areas as it is in the rural areas. But the reality is, it was in the last programme for government to create a plan for loneliness, to create a strategy. It didn't make it. It didn't get done. And that's okay. Sometimes things don't get done. But the problem is programme for governments are different than plans in companies and, organisations. The next plan doesn't have anything to do. It doesn't have a plan for loneliness. It doesn't have that commitment. So sometimes what happens is when you get a new government, they start again rather than continue from where you were. So for us, we're trying to put more energy into it again. We're always looking for new volunteers. We're always saying to older people, if you need support, housing, health, loneliness, no matter what it is, if you're challenged aging at home and you need support, ring us. But on the far side, we will keep campaigning because this issue is not going away until we all do something about it and realise the world has changed. There's no blame involved in any of that to anybody. People are still kind in the community. You see that in the winter. You saw it last week. You'll see it every week how kind and good the community is. But ultimately, things have changed and we just need to adapt to those changes.
In the process of maybe asking people to self-examine, especially if you're, and I suppose it's not age-related, but in the process of asking people to look at their own situation, in that, are there things that they should watch out for? I wonder, am I becoming lonely? If your local butcher or bank is closed, if you're not getting out as much, if your local pub has closed, and I want to bring in here something that, for all its faults, the church has been, in the generation we're talking about's time, when they were growing up and young adults, the church was really protective against isolation because it was that kind of common bond and that regular meeting place for people of faith to discuss things of community.
Absolutely. Look, as the change of society, as you described earlier, has come, some of the big pillars like the church have changed and have fallen. So ultimately is there were lots of good reasons for that. But on the far side there is a loss to a lot of people of that. there's a loss. And so, like as things go online, there are losses to these things, and that have consequences and outcomes that need to be managed, because it's people who suffer, it's people whose health suffer, and their well-being suffers. I think for older people to look out for, you have to be careful in the journey of life as you get older. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes retirement, loss of a group of friends, maybe no longer active in the social community.
I hadn't thought of retirement, because you lose a whole circle of friends if you retire.
You lose circles of friends when you retire. If you were lucky to have a partner and you're bereaved, you lose a whole circle of friends.
If you haven't had a partner, you're probably more likely to be lonely anyway. And if you did, you've lost a friend, as you said.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, it then is if your health, even if it's not constant, unfortunately, 50% of over 50s have a chronic disease. Over 75, people have 2 or 3 things to cope with. And they could be really active and well, but have a bad year of health. And they stop going and stop engaging, and the confidence is gone to go back. So what happens is the fractures of life can lead people to ultimately end up away from the people they were once connected to, away from the supports they once had. And then small decisions become big decisions, worries become harder. And it's like if you got bad news and your healthcare aunt now says coming home to an empty, cold house and nobody to talk to about, nobody to support you. Unfortunately, it's a downward spiral in your housing, in your health, and in your well-being.
It doesn't paint a very good picture. And kind of for the third time this week, I kind of have to ask you, seeing as you're on, with the recent finding of the bodies in Kerry and the newspaper reporting on the Joyce Moynihan today, how important are good, caring neighbours? And I'm not suggesting for any moment that the people in Kerry or Joyce Moynihan didn't have good, caring neighbours, but how do neighbours thread the fine line between imposing on someone's privacy, being a busybody? I mean, that's the danger that they may fall into, and trying to recognise that maybe I should reach out, maybe I should take the chance, because maybe Joe or Mary is lonely.
I think I'll put it to you this way, right? Well, as you say, on loneliness, we paint a depressing picture, right? And that is around 10% of older people. There are plenty of older people out there running our communities, literally physically active, running businesses, childcare, you name it, right? So, like everything else, is whether young or old, this is a subset, but it's a very large subset. I think to answer your question directly, I think 30 years ago you wouldn't ask that question. I think the reality is that's part of our loss. Saying hello to people in the street, knocking into people, saying hello, somehow that's becoming imposing. We didn't think that was imposing 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm cognizant as well that Cork City Coroner Philip Common, who has, of course, held inquests into several such cases of finding people who've passed away in the past 5 years, says it often can be very difficult for family or friends and neighbours to maintain contact with someone who doesn't want it.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day but I think if we look at this from a public health and a health issue, that loneliness is in that area, and which it is, right? And that is that you wouldn't, if you knew somebody was physically unwell, right, you wouldn't give up just because they didn't answer the phone the first time.
Yeah.
The reality of it is it's a journey of life where people have ended up cut off. And so ultimately their physical health and their mental health has been affected. And maybe they've just lost all the confidence. And maybe their self-worth and their value is that they're nearly ashamed because of the situation they're in, and they're worried and they're upset. So their pushing away is nearly sometimes a defence mechanism. And it's for us, this is why some things can be done by neighbours, can be done by supports, other things can be done by organisations like us, and other things will have to be done via the healthcare system.
Well done to you, Seán, for all you're doing and your 4,000 volunteers. You're interacting with 35,000 older people. I just want to leave you one final question. Should people of all ages begin to spend enjoyable time with themselves and start to learn to enjoy their own company as a protection against loneliness in later life?
I think what I'd say to you is it's everything in this area is personal. We all know that there are some people that just can't be left on their own, have to be in the centre of things. And there are other people who have the ability that they're very self-sufficient, right? And that's the challenge here. So ultimately is people need to realise that staying connected, having good relationships, having emotional support, because life is full of ups and downs in our jobs, in our lives, in our families and in our health. And if we don't have friends and those confidants, right, ultimately life gets very difficult.
All right. Seán Moynihan, CEO of Alone, thank you very much